Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ITSS Verona member series podcast section on cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and space. My name is Renata Safina, and today I have an immense pleasure to discuss cybersecurity with Dr. Oleg Goldshmidt from Israel. Shalom, добро пожаловать, welcome.
Hello.
So Dr. Goldschmidt has been involved in various industries and academia throughout his career. In recent years, has been serving in senior roles at leading private cybersecurity companies, and we are using this opportunity to ask him about the national security implications of cybersecurity. Thank you so much, Doctor, for accepting our invitation.
My pleasure.
To dive in, disruption of civilian infrastructure, which is often privately owned, for example, water treatment facilities, ports, and hospitals, raises a question of the scope and influence of a state defense capabilities to protect its infrastructure and its nationals. In your opinion, who is accountable for national cybersecurity, and to what extent the responsibility of security of private nationals lies in private firms?
Let's start from the basic facts. You and me, both of us, and many of our viewers, if not the majority of them, live in societies where private enterprise, non-governmental part of the economy is probably the majority of the whole economic activity in the country. In places where governments rule, that solves the problem, right? They are responsible. In countries like France, where you live, or Israel, where I live, private organizations, private companies supply many of the goods and services with national importance, national security implications, and obviously in those cases, governments have a huge responsibility, but at the same time, they cannot, in my opinion at least, just take over private enterprise and tell them how to do their business. That would strike at the very core of the economic structure of the societies. So there should be some kind of trade-off. And the first thing that every country, every government should think of is what is really important on a national scale, what is really important for national security. And some things may be obvious, defense industries of various kinds, that's kind of obvious, even if those defense industries are populated by private companies. Nuclear power plants, electrical grid, sometimes it is nationalized, sometimes it isn't, but clearly it is an essential part of national infrastructure, and electrical grids are under attack. Think of Ukraine, for instance, just a few years ago, and maybe on an ongoing basis. Water supply, in Israel, there is a kind of private conglomerate that runs the water infrastructure, and our water infrastructure was under attack and is from time to time under attack. Pipelines, think of just a few days ago, the case of the Colonial Pipeline. That's a private company, even privately held, not publicly traded, but given that it runs a pipeline that supplies almost half of all the fuel needs of the eastern border of the United States, that is clearly national infrastructure, national security. And it was taken out, not clear by who. Was it a nation state agent or just some criminals? Whatever is reported in this or that part of media, I'm not I have no knowledge of what really is going on, and media reports may be occasionally misleading. It could have been just criminals who wanted ransom, but the consequences are national for the richest, mightiest country on the face of this planet, to the point that the governments, various governments across the United States, urgently pushed legislation to allow tanker trucks to move fuel over roads. That has its own security implications. Ports and airports, sometimes they are privately operated, even occasionally by companies from other countries. This is something that is being discussed on the national security level here in Israel, for instance. Sometimes things are not so obvious. What about logistics? What if there is a private company that tracks goods and cargoes moving through ports and airports of a country, and they have barcode readers connected to handheld tablets that are manufactured in another country? And those tablets come from the factory with spyware built in. And one country in this puzzle has tremendous strategic advantage because they know everything that goes through the borders of another country. And the second country is in trouble. And you can imagine that I'm describing a case that really, really happened. It's not a fantasy. Medical infrastructure, hospitals, it's not just doctors and nurses. We certainly know that there are national implications just from our experience over the last year or year and a half. And sometimes that dependency is completely non-obvious. For instance, an insurance company in this country was attacked a couple of months ago, not even a particular big insurance company, but some information was stolen from it. And it turned out that this particular insurance company handled car insurance for almost all government employees through Israel. And government employees are not like other government employees. Some might be clerks, and some may have sensitive duties, sensitive positions with national security implications. Those people also have cars, and they also need car insurance. And the data could have been leaked to, I don't know who. So what do governments need to do? Regulation is one, putting up standards, not necessarily from standardization point of view, but just demanding that everybody who handles something that is determined as national importance, national infrastructure, should comply to certain levels of cybersecurity knowledge. That's a start. That would carry a cost. Those public services will cost more just because security costs, right? It's difficult and it's costly. So that's kind of prevention. And then what happens if some organization, private organization, is actually under attack? Who do you call? We all know how to call emergency services, police, fire department, ambulances, 911 in North America, 999 in England, 112 in Europe, I guess. But what if you're under cyber attack? Your house is not on fire, but your computers are taken over. Here in this country, we have an additional emergency number. It's 119. I have no idea if it is 911 written right to left, but it is the CERT. It is the Cyber Emergency Response Team, government run, actually, I believe under the auspices of the Prime Minister's office. And it's an emergency number just like the police. You're under attack, you can call it. That seems to me a pretty good idea. Again, it's a public service that will cost. That's your taxes and mine, right? But that's the other, that's the response part, not the prevention part, but the response part of the whole security posture. I think I'll stop here. I've talked enough.
Thank you. Could you please tell us about the new field called deception technologies, which became a very important trend in cybersecurity domain? And if you could explain how the deception technologies were pioneered and when exactly is it used in the cybersecurity field?
Deception technologies, sometimes called today distributed deception platforms, are indeed relatively new. The history is fairly old. It comes from something called honeypots. A lot of people react, deception is honeypots. Honeypots were basically research projects originally. They were very difficult to set up and not scalable. You had to be a real expert to do that. Today, there are companies that provide deception technology on an industrial scale. It's a turnkey solution almost. The idea, of course, is that alongside real assets in your computer network, you will have traps, essentially. Those traps may be computers, or they may be just pieces of software running on a single computer and connected to many networks. And the overall effect is that they look exactly like the real thing in all respects, maybe up to a certain limit, but the point is detection, especially fast detection. One of the big problems in cybersecurity is the so-called dwell time. Regardless of how many millions of dollars you put into your perimeter defenses, you will be breached. If you think you haven't been breached, you are probably deluding yourself. And the dwell time problem is that between the breach itself and the detection of it, months can pass easily, even in very serious organizations. So having a lot of traps around increases a lot the chances that someone who is moving around your organizational network will hit one of those traps and sirens will go off very quickly, actually. And from experience, it happens really quickly. The big piece of this whole picture in my mind is actually economics. The economics of cybersecurity is skewed in favor of attackers. You don't need to be a genius to mount an attack. You can find tools for free or for symbolic sums in the darker corners of the internet. You can automate it, you can repeat it, you can write programs that will do it again and again and again. And if you fail, you will just try again. And defending is very difficult and hence costly. And traditional tools generate quite a lot of false positives just because a lot more legitimate stuff goes on than attacks. So even a small amount of false positives will dominate the real attacks. So your highly qualified security team will be chasing ghosts. And what happens with this scalable addition of traps that look just like the real thing is that now the attackers are at risk of hitting a trap. And the trap will talk to them, and the trap will lure them, and the trap will actually trap them. And most importantly, red lights will start flashing and sirens will start sounding, and someone will react. And since no one should touch a trap as a matter of normal operations, then actually there will be very few false positives, just because only bad guys who look around the network will touch those traps. So this is the solution. And yet another very important feature of it is that those industrial and medical things that we talked about before, industrial infrastructure, national infrastructure, those are not your normal computers. Those are not PCs or servers. Those are very purpose-made pieces of equipment that are very difficult to replicate. But if you can create a trap in software that mimics your MRI scanner or your industrial device that controls an oil pipeline or water pipeline or an electrical generator, then it will look just like the real thing to a criminal or a spy, and they will look there. So it's fast detection, and of course today the solutions are integrated with response, with other security solutions. So it is a very important additional tool for cyber defense. It is, of course, purely defensive. And in my mind, it certainly should be looked at much more closely than it has been up to now. And it's a fastly developing field.
Thank you for your insight. The tremendous promise of the 5G network created an international race towards reaching the 5G capabilities, potentially exposing the cyber vulnerabilities of the devices and operating system, both public and privately owned. In your opinion, what are the major threats posed by the hasty introduction of the 5G networks, and how could we overcome the cyber threats?
5G. Okay, first of all, it is not to make our conversation clearer or better in any way. 5G, the big idea of 5G is connecting huge numbers, billions and billions of devices and exchanging information between them. Devices not necessarily like our smartphones, but all sorts of sensors, controllers, and so on and so forth. And a lot of work went into making those 5G communications more secure, better encrypted, and so on. But as everything, it is essentially a trade-off. The potential is that it will allow us all, as a planet full of humans, do a lot more interesting, useful things. The trade-off is that it will be much more complex, and on such a large scale, the possibility of making mistakes, and including security mistakes, is greater. Technologically, 5G, unlike the previous generations of communication technologies, it basically standardizes the whole thing, not just the data, but also all the control infrastructure on technologies and protocols that we're familiar with from our normal internet. And that is also a great thing and also a problematic thing. The previous generations of communications had much more esoteric technologies and protocols to start and end and manage, say, phone calls. And whatever is obscure may be not so secure as the mainstream technology. At the same time, this is more difficult for attackers who need to learn those obscure technologies and find holes in them. And it is also more difficult for people who actually develop and manage them because they make new mistakes. The holes in the internet, in normal internet technologies, are patched quite quickly. something that is not as mainstream can remain vulnerable, and historically has been vulnerable for much longer. If we use the same technologies, then similar kinds of attacks as attacks on our normal personal computers and laptops and servers may actually work. And let's not forget that some of the security holes are design holes, so to say, the bad design, insecure design of those technologies and protocols themselves. And some may be just mistakes in implementations. So the overall design is fine, but now we have billions of devices produced by hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of vendors, and under a lot of restrictions and limitations, and maybe some of them will be vulnerable, even though the protocols are perfectly fine, just the implementation will be vulnerable. Another big characteristic of 5G is that the whole management infrastructure is software-based. We talk about software-defined networks and network function virtualization. Those are just terms, but the point is that the whole management infrastructure will be incredibly flexible. You will be able to do a lot more than what you can do with today's communication infrastructure. And that is obviously great. Doing more is, by definition, good. But it is also, again, by definition, more complex. And that is the trade-off. Whatever is more complex to manage. It's easier to make mistakes. It is easier to do something quite sophisticated and make a security mistake. And the simpler things will also be more complex just because the whole infrastructure is so much more complex. And that is also a big trade-off in many respects, including security. So at a very high level, and without getting into anything technical related to 5G, I think that this complexity is a good thing and a bad thing together, and somehow we will need to find the right compromise, shall we say.
Thank you. And to finish up, I would like to dive deep into the recent developments. And the current pandemic has accelerated the pathway towards cashless society and has increased the threat of cyber attacks for banks and crypto exchanges. As you have a lot of experience and backgrounds in finance and financial technologies, could you explain why cybersecurity is increasingly important for the financial services industries, both for consumers and companies? And in your opinion, is the financial world developing accordingly in the digital era? And is the industry focused enough on cybersecurity?
There are lots of parallels with what I was saying about 5G, actually. So the old world, right? The old bank with cash. You had to go to your branch, present some documents, ID, maybe a check, and you walked out with a bunch of cash in your wallet, right? And banks had money in vaults, and they were occasionally robbed. One famous bank robber was asked why he robbed banks, and they said that's where the money is, right? So in today's brave new world, with all those new banks where there are no branches and everything is at your fingertips on your smartphone or your laptop, there may be no cash, but your bank account, your money can be accessed from just about everywhere. And it's a great thing. You will have lots of advantages, both operationally. You can transfer money just from a coffee shop with your smartphone, or maybe waiting for a bus. You will have a lot of advantages financially. You will be able to get credit or loans where you couldn't before. you will have access to financial services that were unknown a year ago. And all those are great things, but at the same time, again, what used to be in a tightly guarded vault at a bank caused you problems. You had to go to your branch. But today it is accessible over the wire or over the air. And if you do it from your smartphone, I'm wondering if that is such a good idea security-wise. We all hope it is secure, but let's not forget that smartphones in particular were essentially designed as a business model to collect information about you. All the apps that we use do that one way or another. And there are restrictions, but I'm not entirely sure that Apple and Google are winning that particular war. So whether or not you should be accessing your main bank account or your medical information, for that matter, from a smartphone is a question in my mind. And the answer to that question is in the distance that exists in your mind between paranoia and realism. Same thing if you do that, if you do access your bank, say from a computer provided by your employer, especially if it is a big, sophisticated company. I'm not sure you can always trust that whoever you are talking to is in fact your bank. In fact, I'm quite sure you cannot always trust that. Just on a personal level, I don't access my bank account from my smartphone. I do access it from my personal computer that I manage, but I'm also quite capable of managing it. I wouldn't do it from a computer provided by my employer. It's not that I don't trust my employer, but things happen and there are people who might be in the middle. It's not just money, by the way, it's also information, privacy. Are you sure that you want someone else to know what you spend your money on or whom you transfer money to and how much? All those neobanks that proliferate over the last few years, my impression is that they have great models on paper. They're still kind of immature, and today they are at a stage where they try to find their market. The basic business model and financial model is not stable yet. They have lots of great ideas, but somehow we will need to enter that brave new world and find the right trade-off between convenience. Obviously, accessing a bank account from your smartphone is very convenient, a lot more convenient than going to a branch. And the trade-offs related to, in particular, security, privacy, and so on and so forth. And it's a general thing about security. Security prevents you from doing good, interesting things, and it costs. And I don't know of any way around that. And the financial industry, banking industry is no exception.
Thank you very much for your insights. Lots of room for thought, lots of information. It was very, very interesting. And it was an immense pleasure to welcome you here for another episode of ITSS Verona podcast on cybersecurity. Thank you very, very much indeed. It was a real treat. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.